They designed and built their airplane at their bicycle shop in their hometown, Dayton, Ohio. Then, on December 17, 1903, beginning at 10:35 a.m., Wilbur and Orville Wright flew their airplane over the sandhills at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They picked Kitty Hawk because the National Weather Service said that consistent winds there would give them their very best chance for success. Over 90 minutes, they flew 4 times that day. The first flight was 12 seconds, 120 feet in the air. The fourth flight was 59 seconds, 852 feet in the air. That morning, the Wrights changed the history of the world. Immediately, plane designers, especially in the United States, France, Britain, Germany, and Italy, started creating their own planes that would go higher and faster than on that morning at Kitty Hawk. Just a dozen years after the Wrights' first flights, planes from many countries flew combat against each other in what is called the Great War, World War I. "20 years later, World War II became the most destructive war ever, then or now, but for 4 years, beginning in 1914, the Great War was devastating. 16 million people died, and the airplane revolutionized warfare. The war started in Europe. The United States entered the war a few years later and sent its first airplane to France in 1917. It was the DH-4, a bomber reconnaissance plane named after its original British designer, Geoffrey de Havilland. More than 1,200 DH-4s arrived in France, and nearly 700 of them performed target surveillance, intelligence gathering, and bombed German positions on the ground. This was not a glamorous flying. While the famous Rickenbacker, Richthofen, and other pilots were ace dogfighters for the United States and Germany, DH-4 crews were freezing in their open cockpits, crashing, being shot down, breaking down, and at times even running into their own bombs that were headed toward the ground. Plane and crew losses were heavy. Many medals of honor were presented to DH-4 crews for their courage and their patriotism. They had a significant effect on the outcome of the war. After the war, the DH-4 became the principal airplane to start airmail service in 1918 in the United States. The DH-4 was the cornerstone for commercial aviation in America. Please welcome, thank you. Please welcome our DH-4 and our O2A team, and I'll introduce them in a moment.
You're next.
Gents are sitting down. And so on your far right, Dorian Walker is the DH-4 guy. The two guys in the middle, John Foote, Gary Wycliffe, are his engineer restorer team. And immediately on my left is Bob Schaefer, and he is a commercial pilot and has a vast background with U.S. Coast Guard, and he is the owner of this airplane right here, which we're going to talk about later. Gentlemen, welcome to Warbirds.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Dorian, start us off. 1917 airplane, and this one is how many? Is this flying?
Not yet. It is about to start its test flying. We're aiming September right now.
Is there a DH-4 flying anywhere in the world?
There's one other DH-4, David, flying. It's in New Zealand.
Tell us about this airplane. What's your passion about old airplanes, this and your Jenny?
Well, our team reconstructed a 1917 Curtiss Jenny. And we did it because one day we had a pile of parts in a hangar, and there was some young people that came in to look at this. And I was told that they were really interested in it. I couldn't understand why, because it's just like a beached whale, didn't look like an airplane or anything like that. And so we started we did 3 groups of kids, and I said, well, we must have gotten all the geeks because they seem to be really interested in this and not looking at their cell phone or looking at the airplanes in the airport where they're doing it. And so the light bulb went on to all of us that are working on this thing that this is going to be the foundation of what we become Friends of Jenny and flying the Jenny for 4 flying seasons across America, introducing to America the young and the old of what these beautiful aircraft look like in the sky. So Jenny, we have flown to 14 states. We're the only one in the world to fly cross country. We were asked 2 main questions at air shows. One is, how did it get here if they didn't see it fly in? And the second was, where'd the guns go? And we said, well, the Jenny didn't have guns. It was a trainer. We're all very proud Americans, our whole team, and a lot of veterans in our group. And so we had, about 3 years ago, we had the centennial, the World War I centennial out on the horizon. And so at one of our board meetings, we said, what would happen if we could tell the entire American early military history? Show the training, the mass-produced Jenny trainer, and then America's first warplane, the DH-4. And the group said, let's do it, if we can find an original airframe. So it took us a little while, and we did.
Where did you find it?
We found it up in Washington State, and it's the last known available airframe, original airframe. And so we acquired it. We tried a fundraiser, and a lot of interest, but not enough funds. So a whole group of us here took out a loan because we said this is really important. And so we borrowed the money to start the production.
You borrowed the money personally to do this?
A group of us did, yes.
Oh.
It's an important story to tell because it not only salutes those aviators that so proudly answered the call 100 years ago, but as being Warbird number 1, it tells the story of all aviators, men and women, all colors, that have stepped into the cockpits to defend freedom across the world. And we think this airplane represents that.
John, you're heavy into caring about young people and the education part of all this. What do you do to get this information to young people so they can digest it and get excited about it?
Well, I personally think that what's missing in aviation is what I call fingers through the fence. We don't have enough kids, enough young people looking through the fence, dreaming of flying. So what we're doing currently, and we had a whole bunch of high school students help on the DH-4, is an internship program. We're working with 3 local high schools in South Central Tennessee and even a couple of homeschool families coming out once a week to help work on the airplanes, learning about the history, learning about the methods that were used, and just trying to get them excited about aviation and about the history of that. So it's hands-on. I mean, they're putting their hands on the airplanes that's 100 years old. It's the history for them. And then that's actually filtered down. Now we have some of the school administrators and some of the history teachers interested in what they're doing and what the students are doing.
So Dorian, in this whole education process, so what are you teaching about the history of the DH-4 and about this model airplane and what those planes did in 1917, 18?
Well, one of the things that kids find most fascinating is on these early airplanes, all of the flying controls are on the exterior. So they go and fly a Cessna 150 or 172, and they come and look at this, and they realize this is how aviation began. They can see how the cables work. They can see how the elevator works, how all the ailerons work. And that's sort of the first thing. I think they're really just enamored with the fact that there's so many wires, they're big, they're kind of cumbersome, and they fly so slow. I mean, there's nothing like, we haven't had this in the air, but I tell you, there's nothing like seeing a Jenny in the air. It is a piece of poetry. And then you realize this also represents a big educational part of it. It's not just about aviation. It's about American ingenuity, entrepreneurship, hard work, all those things that we'd like to think America is the best at.
Right. Go back to the history of this airplane. We heard a little bit about it in the video, but talk about what the plane actually did in the air over France and Germany.
Well, you know, when we finally got into the war in 1917, there was no Air Force to mention. There was one aero squadron. They had a bunch of unserviceable, no combat airplanes at all, so a few training airplanes. Congress, it's kind of interesting, Congress appropriated the largest amount of money in the history of the United States to that date to build an Air Force, $640 million. Wow. And with that, they said, let's get going. But building these airplanes, even on an assembly line, was not an easy thing at all. So the first thing that the Warbird did is they put together a committee, as most government agencies do, and they sent them to France and England to say, we don't have time to design an airplane. Let's find an airplane we can adapt to American production. So they looked at the French, they looked at the British, and they found that the de Havilland DH-4, which was very successful for the Royal Flying Corps, was something that they thought would adapt itself pretty well to American production. So that's the one that they acquired. They brought it back, and lo and behold, they found out to begin with, the British don't use inches and feet. So the first roadblock to the production of America's warplane was in front of them. So they began to make, find ways around that. So when they built them, they got an order, a lot of money, and no engines, by the way. That's another whole story, which Gary can really help you address. But they needed to build an airframe and do it quickly. So they adapted the DH-4. They got an order for a total of about, initially, 4,400 of them. They're from 3 aircraft manufacturers. Dayton Wright did most of them. They did about a little over 3,000. And then Standard Aircraft Company did about 200. And then Body by Fisher did about 800, I think. So of those, about 1,200, as you mentioned in your piece, were sent to France. I think 1,284, actually. So they were then put together, because they're shipped in pieces, and then they were farmed out to 13 Army Air Service squadrons. 5 of those were bomber squadrons. The others were observation squadrons. And they went to 4 Marine Navy squadrons as well, to be used as principally as bombers. And those were the ones that were in Belgium, most of them. So they farmed out to these squadrons. Generally 16 airplanes was in the squadron. And they began the task of using the sky to defend democracy.
And this was only, 13, 14 years after the Wrights flew.
Absolutely.
And yet
absolutely.
the Italians, the Germans, the Brits especially, and the French were building airplanes.
Yep. Well, think about this. On the bomber version of this, it could initially carry 10 bombs, 5 25-pound bombs under each wing. So as anyone that's flown bombers or tested this, you know that when you lose that weight, your aircraft's going to suddenly
Lurch.
Yeah. So what they developed, another innovation that this airplane's responsible for, they developed a stabilizer that had a trim. There's a big wheel in the pilot's cockpit. It looks like a nautical wheel. And there's a worm gear that connects to the worm gear back in the vertical post in the tail fin. And it would allow you to move on a set of hinges the back of the stabilizer up or down, depending upon how you needed to adjust it. So there was an innovation that was started on this aircraft that changed the way certain aspects of aviation are done today.
Gary, he mentioned about the engine. Talk about the original engines and about what this engine is and where did it come from?
This engine basically was designed from scratch to power this aircraft. 2 gentlemen was in a motel room in Washington, D.C., and I think in a series of 10 days to 2 weeks.
This is the original engine?
This engine here.
Oh, this
Yeah,
one, this one,
yeah.
yeah.
They laid out and designed this engine, and then they started making the molds and the dies to put this engine together. And this engine has been used in, not only this aircraft, but when they got through with flying here, they also used these in a lot of boats, and they've put into power units for various applications. The surplus was.
And how much power does this have? How many?
This is 400 horsepower at 1,650 RPM.
Are there any original engines from DH-4s?
This is an original, but
It
it's
is?
been completely rebuilt. Yes, there's originals, but they're hard to find. But this is an original engine.
John, what is your role, besides the education aspect, in restoring this airplane?
The easiest way to explain that is I get to make it look good. I do the fabric covering, I do the assembly rigging, the painting, those kinds of things.
Right. Dorian?
By
Yeah,
the way,
go ahead.
you have to ask John about rigging, because he is, in my opinion, I've flown the Jenny for 4 years. From the test flight on, I mean, the rigging and the things that he's responsible, because I was looking, when our team was looking for someone to do that, I mean, there's, in the Jenny alone, and here there's even greater cable, there's a mile of cable. And if you don't have your stagger correct, if you don't have your incidence correct, if you don't have the tension correct, just think of all the things that can go wrong. And this guy's like a piano tuner. I don't know where he learned it, what he drank or what pill he took, but I'll fly anything he rigs.
Hey, speaking of that, you mentioned first flights, and we know that first flights are a really big deal of an airplane, because who knows? I mean, even with computers, whether it's going to do what it's supposed to do when it takes off. And Edwards Air Force Base, we all know, has lost a lot of pilots over the years, fewer of late, of course, because of computers. But back to slipsticks, slide rules. How many of you here have never heard of a slide rule? Well, there's one. That's okay. But at any rate, first flight's a big deal. What was your first flight in the Jenny like, and how nerve-generating was it?
Well, Jennies have a reputation of vibrating. I didn't know if it was me or the plane that was vibrating more. It was, and these guys were there on that first flight. As anything, you're saying, will this thing fly? And it turns out where we were doing our flight testing was in a small runway that John had created between two taxiways and a small airport in Kentucky. At one end of the runway was a pond, and I've seen the movie The Great Waldo Pepper, and I know how Axel landed in the palm. So I was thinking about, well, will I land in the pond, or should I bring a life preserver with me? And then the other end, it sits on a plateau, is the mountain. So I had two choices of getting it off the ground and then of getting it back on the ground. It was either the pond or the mountain. But somehow, luck was with us. And
So what was it like for you two on the ground watching what he just described?
Nervous. You watch it take off and it started to settle, and you think, oh my goodness. And then it takes off, then a few passes and it gets on the ground, then you start to breathe again.
So does it fly better now than the Jenny than it did then?
well, the Jenny has no aerodynamic stability, so you're constantly flying it, and you just have to get used to that. The one thing I did learn was I wasn't strong enough to fly the Jenny. I made it around the pattern 3 times, and they probably thought, oh, he's coming down earlier, or I think it'd stay up longer. No, it's because I couldn't hold the stick any longer. And you have to realize these, as much as I like to think of myself as 18 or 19 or 20, or wished I could be there, like some other people here would probably say the same thing, is that they were built for young, athletic men. And strength wasn't a problem. They didn't have trim tabs originally, then they were added. And so the first thing I did, once I got safely on the ground, I said, I need to begin a program that I continue today. I do 50 push-ups every day, do arm, just so that you've got the strength if you need it. We have since we do a lot of cross-country flying, and I've got a really long cross-country over mountains coming up here in a few weeks, is that we have installed a trim tab in the John has, so we can trim it up a bit in the elevator.
push-up getting in shapes make you sound like Sean D. Tucker every day.
We don't do anything like Sean D. Tucker does. We're slow and
Well,
slow.
what altitude? If you're going over the Rockies?
No, we're going to go over the Appalachians. That's
so-
famous. The Suicide Alley. That's what the old male pilots called it. Yeah, because they got
And
lost.
how much altitude?
Well, we'll try to get as high as we can, at least 1,000 feet over the mountains. You have to ask Gary. He was flying with me down to Maxwell, and we hit some of the mountains. And how are those downdrafts anyway?
Gary, what was it like?
You know, where's the airplane going? You know, the wing drops, lose a couple hundred feet, and when you're flying at 700 or 800 feet, okay, you get it back, but it's she's got a mind of her own. You don't ever let go of her.
How effective was the plane in Europe in World War I?
This airplane?
Yeah.
Well, this airplane was really, I'm told by the historians that I've talked to, even though it came into the war late, it really accomplished a lot. It was one of the fastest airplanes, as big and bulky as this. You say, oh, Fokkers and Albatrosses, who you'll see this posed with, make sure you go over the World War I aviation after this. They'll just have their field day with it. They didn't. This was faster than those airplanes. Right. At that time, it was 125 miles an hour. And so there were certainly some of the later German planes that could keep up with it, but it really could get there. And because of the armament, we of course, the British only put one gun on each, on the front and the back, and us being Americans, we have to be more aggressive and better, so we put two guns. So we got two 30 caliber guns, Lewis guns on the rear, and two Marlins for the pilot in the front.
So, all in all, what do you expect this plane to perform as, and what are you going to do with it once you get it up in the air?
Well, we built this really for one reason alone, and that's to pay tribute to American military aviation. So we're looking at the possibility of getting it to France. They're interested in it. This is depicting the 50th Aero Squadron, the colors on this airplane, and they were one of the squadrons that won not won, but were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. And it was number 6 that did it, and they were looking for the Lost Battalion, which many people have heard, and there's been books and things written. And these pilots had been shot at, and their plane, which was number 2, not number 6, barely made it back to the airfield. But they thought they found the battalion, so they talked to their CO and said, "We got to go again." Weather was bad, late afternoon. They climbed back in. Their last flight. Wow. Germans decimated them. They flew low. They were dropping. They found the battalion, and they were dropping supplies to them, which was one of the first air-to-ground supply missions, another first of this airplane. Wow. So our notion is to try to tell as many people as we can this story, and that, again, it represents the terrific courage that the men and women of America have exhibited every time they've climbed into any kind of a cockpit to defend liberty.
So when you fly, and when, September, you hope?
Our test flight, that's when we're hoping to
test flight in September?
Yeah. There's interest in getting it to Europe to fly that mission. It was based out of Remacourt on October 6th, that mission. And the town and the French officials are working hard. If anybody knows anybody at the Pentagon level that would like to help find us a C-5, or we'd even go with a C-130 to take it over, we could get it there. And they'd like for us to fly that mission. The original field is as it was 100 years ago.
Really?
It's owned by the mayor of the town, and they're crazy about trying to get this thing back. And then, of course, it'd be great to be there to celebrate the armistice as well.
So when you first fly this, though, in Kentucky, yes?
Tennessee.
Winchester,
Tennessee.
Will you publicize that ahead of time, or you're going to do it pretty much on the hush-hush?
Well, we were thinking about lining up, working with Sofa Factory and lining up sofas all along the runway and selling seats. If nothing else, it'll at least be fun that first flight.
And pay off part of the debt.
Maybe.
Right. So let's get a little more modern here. Bob, tell us about this airplane.
Well, the Skymaster, built by Cessna, is a military adaptation of a civilian airplane. During Vietnam War, the Air Force was using the O-1 as an observation airplane. The O-1 was a two-seat single-engine airplane that really was
Cessna.
not that much a Cessna, not that much different than a Piper Cub. It had grown bigger and more complex, of course, but still relatively slow, with only one engine. And its job was to go out and find the enemy and communicate that location to the attack aircraft and artillery units and crews on the ground to be able to interact.
So
with
they
the
were
enemy.
forward air controllers.
They were forward air controllers. They were like the conductor of the orchestra of battle. They didn't play any of the instruments, if you will, but they told everybody else where to go and when. So the Air Force needed something faster, more survivable, and although what they wanted later turned into the OV-10 Bronco, it took a long time to design an airplane from a clean sheet of paper. They needed something now. So they turned to Cessna, and Cessna said, hey, we have this new civilian business airplane that we designed to compete with Piper's Seneca. Maybe you guys would be interested in it. So
And about what year was this?
this was in about 1967, 1966, 67. So the Air Force, for a couple of weeks, tried one of these civilian airplanes. They tried flying it. Hey, this is pretty neat. And they let's try it some more. So they set up a real evaluation of the Cessna Skymaster business airplane. And they said, yeah, we like this thing. We want to buy a bunch of them. But Cessna, we need you to make some changes. So they made a list of the things they wanted different. We want different systems in it. We want different radios. We want the ability to mount ordnance, weapons on the aircraft. We need some more windows. We need this thing and that thing. They made a whole list of things. And Cessna said, sure,
Based on what the
Based on the-
01 pilots had
Yes.
told them they needed.
Exactly, based on the mission requirements. So Cessna said, sure, we can do that. And the Air Force said, great, we'll call it the O2A. And Cessna set about building them. And this is an example of an O2A designed as a combat aircraft, a forward air control aircraft. It has hard points, pylons under the wings that can carry offensive weaponry. Usually those were marking rockets, and the forward air controller at the enemy or a location that he wanted to point out to the fast-moving attack aircraft. He'd fire off a marking rocket, and then he had a suite of radios. So he could talk to the attack aircraft, he could talk to naval artillery, army artillery, whomever he needed to talk to, and he'd tell them to use his puff of smoke as a reference, hit my smoke, or hit 100 yards north or west of it, as the case may be, to direct their weapons onto target. So that was the role of the O2A. It was at the very point of the spear, finding the enemy, marking their location, and directing iron onto the target. And then after, it stuck around and assessed the damage that had been done, and it could photograph that damage, and also could be in charge of combat search and rescue should any other aircraft be down. He could direct the search and rescue activities. So that's, in a nutshell, what the O2A did.
Just how dangerous was that forward air controller flying? Low altitude?
Very.
Low altitude,
word.
low speed.
And armed with little more than a microphone and maybe a pistol in your holster. Yeah, that was because the O2A didn't carry really offensive armament.
Yeah.
The rockets were used for marking enemy locations. Some models, sometimes they carried minigun pods, but the miniguns could be used while on a
Strafing
rocket
run?
market. Yeah, they could be used for strafing. They weren't really very effective. And they were used mostly just to make the bad guys keep their head down while you're marking their location. But the bad guys learned pretty quickly to keep their head down because they didn't want to be found by the O2. So not being completely dumb, they'd keep a low profile. And once the O2 had gone by, like whack-a-mole, they'd pop up then and start shooting at the back of the O2. So O2 pilots learned pretty quickly to keep moving, to keep maneuvering all the time, and to look behind them because that's probably where the enemy was.
Right.
So then there was another variant of the O2 called the O2B. The Air Force couldn't get the O2A quite fast enough, so they actually went to Cessna and took some civilian 337s off the assembly line. They went to some dealers and bought some back, and they actually went to some private owners who had just taken delivery of their nice new airplanes and said, hey, we'll buy them back from you. They put Air Force paint jobs on them, and they put some extra radios in them. And those became the O-2B, which is pretty much a standard civilian airplane with an Air Force paint job. And those were used for liaison activity, and they were also used for psychological warfare. They were equipped with a leaflet dispensing chute that allowed leaflets to be dispersed out of the airplane. They carried them below the rear propeller so that the leaflets wouldn't get turned into confetti going through the rear propeller. So they could be used for psychological warfare that way. And they also had a loudspeaker built into the side. You take the baggage compartment door off and put a big loudspeaker and amplifier in there so they could broadcast messages to the enemy locations. So psychological warfare, they were sometimes called the BS bombers, and you can fill in the blanks.
Yeah. There's one story regarding that. How many of you know about Bud Anderson? P-51 Mustang pilot. He's the ranking living American ace right now. When he finished his test flight career, after he came back from Europe, he was a test pilot for many, many years at Wright Field and Edwards Air Force Base. And Bud had 2 years left in his career. And he was offered the chance to go back to the Pentagon, probably get his first star as a brigadier general, and sit at a desk for his last 2 years as an officer in the Air Force. He refused to do that. There was an opening for a wing commander in Vietnam, and he volunteered and became a fighter bomber wing commander in Vietnam or in the Philippines, flying missions over Vietnam. His son Jim was then an Air Force pilot flying this airplane. And against regulation, maybe I shouldn't tell this, I don't know.
Go ahead.
Huh? Go ahead. Sam said it's okay. Good. So anyway, Bud flew over to Vietnam from Clark Field one day and got, contrary to regulations, in the O-2A with his son. They were never supposed to fly together. And by the way, they did not tell Mom and Bud's wife that they were doing this. And anyway, Bud went on a mission and was throwing pamphlets out of an O-2A as a wing commander. He'll be here tomorrow afternoon. I'll see if I can get him to tell it, but don't count on it. I don't think he will. So when you hear this talk about what it took to get that airplane in the air, and you talk about all these frequencies and radios and all this great stuff, what goes through your mind thinking back to what they dealt with?
Well, think of the remarkable advances in technology from the time of this airplane to the time of this airplane to what we have today.
Mm.
Wow, that's just astonishing. So I applaud you fellows for telling the story of this, because it's so important that not just young people, but some people who aren't very young anymore know that and can appreciate that. That's one of the reasons my lovely bride and I like to take this airplane around to air shows, is to tell the story of the brave men who went to war in this airplane. Let's face it, a painted over, converted civilian business plane that was put into uniform and pressed into service.
Some might suggest go figure.
Yeah. And so many of them didn't come back.
Yeah.
There were a little over 500 of these produced between 1967 and 1970 for the Air Force. Just under 200 of them were to all causes. So a lot of brave men went to battle in this airplane and didn't come back. So it's very sobering. There are about 37 of them on the FAA registry today. And whether those are all airworthy or not is unknown, but that's how many are still registered. So not a lot
Damon,
left.
when did you get the bug to get into old airplanes and become such a passion? What was the trigger?
I think probably like a lot of people, when I was a kid, My father joined the Army Air Corps, and so I grew up in that what later became an Air Force family. And my parents, told me about he was at Langley Field, and going up on the berm and looking and seeing those airplanes taking off and pointing to them. I think from then on, I mean, when I was a kid, for some reason I started with this. I don't know why. I guess I was just intrigued by they looked interesting and complicated, and then of course you got all the great stories of the day that you would hear about the Red Baron and about Eddie Rickenbacker and all these British heroes, and the great risks that they took in these little paper-thin airplanes. I think that's probably what got me going. And then of course I love history because I do believe, and apply what you do, Bob, and the notion is that history is the foundation we build a better future on, and we all believe in that, and the more we can share it with people, the better, hopefully, we'll have a future for.
And by the way, Damien, in his day job, is an award-winning documentary maker and historian, and so you're putting the two passions together.
You betcha.
So, Gary, when did you get hooked on engines, among other things? Are you a vet?
No, I'm not. But as a kid, I used to put little balsa wood model airplanes together every night. And as far as the engines, I started working on the engines when I was about 8 years old.
Really?
And then I had a diesel business I, quote, was supposed to retired from. And then when they started a Jenny project, I went out and volunteered to remove a few bolts. And that was, 6 years ago? So, and you meet a lot of nice people at these events.
Did you get hooked or did you get trapped?
Yeah. Yeah, you could say both.
John, what about you? When did you a teacher? You sound like a teacher.
Yeah, I've taught at A&P schools, and currently I have a flight school and a maintenance training center. We train a lot of pilots and mechanics for mission service. So I got in the older airplanes mainly because of the challenge, because it's so challenging. There's, you're going back in time to an era where aerodynamics is in its infancy, but it's a challenge to do it because you're not just parts changing, you're not just, you have to really understand what's going on in the airplane, especially for the rigging of the airplane. You get a really good understanding of what's going on. So I like it for the challenge, the reward with the students. We have one of our A&P students sitting over there, Lissa. Hi, Lissa. And she's about halfway through our A&P program. Right. And to see a student's light, to see the light come on for them when the understanding of something like this transfers over to the modern day airplanes. And so for me, getting hooked on this, I tell people a lot of times, if you're a fan of The Matrix, sometimes I wish I would have taken the blue pill. But it's the challenge and the reward of seeing a pile of parts end up looking like this.
Like that. Oh, wonderful. Yeah. So this concludes this part of our program. Sam Bass, who is about to stand up, maybe, watch. He did. He stood up and dropped his microphone. Oh, that was good, Sam.
I forgot it was there.
Sam Bass is an extraordinary aviator, over 35,000 pilot hours that he has logged. And Sam is going to speak with Damien and Bob here and answer your questions about these two airplanes. Gentlemen, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
The first thing I would like to ask you, Damien, is you said that this was a pile of parts, or actually a puzzle, I guess, when you got it. Where'd you get the plans to put it together?
That's top secret, and I would have to kill you if I let you know.
Did plans actually exist
yes.
for it?
That's an excellent question. The government, in 1950 whatever, at Wright, issued a contract to photograph a whole series of the old plans. So they're on microfilm.
Was that a reverse engineering, or you could just actually pull off?
Well, we used them, but every time we got into trouble, it was generally because of the plans.
Did you alter any of it to make it a little bit safer, or as far as materials
we
or any of that?
We like to live on the edge.
Okay. Let me ask you about the engine. The engine it was used, I guess, for something else, and you guys rebuilt it, or you rebuilt it, Gary, is that correct?
Well, we had a gentleman in Idaho rebuild it. I went out for a while and helped him to learn about the engine. But yeah, it's, Liberty V12, 400 horsepower, I think 1,650 cubic inches, which it's a kind of a unique, simple engine, but yet it's complicated. To reduce its size, they use one journal to run 2 cylinders, so it's not offset, so it makes it more compact. 2 carburetors, 2 distributor systems on it. It's a dry sump system. It's really a simple engine, but probably until it breaks.
Well, Packard was partially responsible for the design of this engine, right?
There was, Packard.
Scott Hall.
Yeah.
Go ahead, no, he's telling me what to do.
Packard, Lincoln, Buick, Cadillac, Ford, and then there was a Marmon and another one that actually produced the Liberty engine, because one manufacturer couldn't produce them fast enough.
Okay.
For everybody.
Well, talking about the engine now, you on the Jenny, what is that, an OX5? You haven't? What engine?
The Jenny had an OX5 in it, yeah. But it's notorious for not being very reliable, like a 50-hour TBO on it. So in order to fulfill our mission to educate people and move around the country and not have to truck the thing and take it apart and put it together, we as a group decided that it would be safer, for one thing, which, pilots are expendable.
Yeah.
But we put a General Motors engine in it. Was back in that day, the Jenny was made to accept several different types of engines. The OX5 is V8 water cooled, 90 horsepower. So we built up basically a 383 stroker Chevy with a gear reduction on it. And so far it's been doing it. I think we got like 350 hours of flying.
What did you think when you first cranked that engine up?
Which one?
This one right here.
This one hasn't been cranked here, but I had the film where the guy that built it cranked it before he shipped it to us to check it. It's awesome.
Where do you get a prop like that? I mean, you're not going to go down to Cincy and buy one.
Cincy did build this for us.
Oh, did they?
Yeah,
We had the plans, and we met with them down there. And of course, they're a great supporter of vintage aviation. And they were challenged. They got their young engineers, and we got a picture of them all standing over a big set of plans trying to figure this thing out. So yeah, they did a good job for us.
Well, how about the paint scheme on the airplane? What does it represent?
Well, when they were delivered from Dayton Wright, they started in this scheme. So they didn't have the squadron markings and they didn't have the numbers on them. They were basically green on the top for camouflage, so if you're looking from the sky, they'd blend in with the green foliage, or gray from beneath, so they'd go into the gray skies over Europe, I guess. So that's how it was delivered. And then when it was assigned to one of those squadrons, in this case the 50th Aero Squadron, all these young men, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, had mothers that liked to clean the sink with Dutch cleanser, the cleanest thing in the world. So they decided they would adapt that logo to clean the skies over France of all the Germans.
Right. Got to wait till the tri-motor goes over here, man. Bob, let's jump 60 years ahead now, back over to the 02 here. Tell me about this particular airplane, where you got it, and the restoration of it.
Well, we were we're the second civilian owners. The first civilian owner, we did not know. He passed away and bequeathed it to an organization that we purchased it from. They just wanted to pass it through. So we were luckily in the right place at the right time. He had done some restoration. This airplane originally had a big rack of radios in the back that were used for all that communication. A big 400-pound rack of radios that had these things called tubes in them in many cases.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they didn't work very well back in the 60s. They were kind of obsolete. So those had all been taken out and modern military radios installed. So we decided, hey, there's no point in being so authentic. We go backward in time and put junk back in. So we use that space to carry stuff, but it still has all the radio communication capability it had back then, but with more modern military avionics. So we have VHF AM, VHF FM, UHF. It can be equipped with HF, but that's not really used very much, so we don't have that capability. And of course, now we have GPS, so we don't need the original ADF that it used to have back then. So it's so that takes care of the radio part of it. Everything else is relatively authentic, as best as we can get it, knocking on wood. We've added a couple of, well, we have all the pylons on it. We've added a camera port on the bottom, which was used for a Ka-18 strike camera to do reconnaissance of a battle damage assessment photography. So we have that camera. We didn't bring it. When you put that camera in, you have to take the right seat out, and we thought, well, maybe it would be nice to have a seat for whoever sits in the right side, whether it's my wife or I, depending on who's flying it. And all the antennas are as it should have been. We don't have original armament that did not carry bombs like that. Those are there just because, okay? It normally would carry rocket launchers, much like the A-26 that was here a while ago. It had rocket launchers and grenade launchers, both of which were standard armament on the O2, and a couple of different grenade launchers, flare launchers, and various other things. But it didn't really carry bombs. But that's poetic license, if you will.
Okay, well, you've flown and owned a number of airplanes, helicopters. How does this airplane fly compared to some of your airplanes?
Oh, it's beautiful. It flies like a big Cessna. As you would expect a plane that Cessna designed for businessmen to fly. It flies like a big, heavy 182. It's very well mannered, very stable. It's just a great cross-country platform. And yet, if you want to muscle it around, you can maneuver it. It's a real honest airplane. Like I say, it flies like a big Cessna, and that's exactly what it is. It is, however, not a single-engine airplane with an extra engine. And a lot of people see that it has sort of conventional look. It's got a motor in the front. Hey, it's a big single-engine plane with an extra engine. One of the common questions is, do you use both engines? And the answer is, of course, yes. It's a multi-engine airplane because it needs two engines to fly. It's a heavy airplane, 4,800 pounds max gross. It's comparable to the Piper Seneca, which is what Cessna designed it to compete with in the business market. Then the Air Force added drag and weight, but they didn't add more power, so it needs both engines to
It's
fly.
kind of strange that they would add all this, but they would also say, well, the gross weight's 1,000 pounds more now.
Yeah, well, they kind of, and sometimes they would push it more than that. There are apocryphal stories of the airplane being loaded up with fuel, loaded up with ordnance, and loaded up with stuff inside, practically until the tires were mashed flat. And a young lieutenant would come out and see the plane and say, "Why, sir, that's over gross," and go fly the airplane. Which they did, and it flew successfully, and they just kind of push all the levers forward, go fly, and bring it back.
Those of us that were military pilots at junior, you just did what you were told.
Exactly.
If they told you to do it, it must have been okay.
Exactly, and they did that day after day after day, so it worked okay.
And probably still do.
Yeah, they
Okay,
still
I want to thank all you folks for coming with us, spending the time, and thank you guys. I learned a lot here.